Welcome to our 13th episode of One Work, 5 Questions with Dr. M. Andrew Holowchak and your host, Donna Vitek. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Holowchak.
How are you doing, Donna? Beautiful day today. Ready to rock.
Yeah, it is. I think it may rain here in Florida.
Not here, I don't think so. It's a nice day.
Oh, we can use the rain. Dr. Holowchak is a retired professor and the world's foremost expert in Thomas Jefferson. I haven't had a question yet that he can't answer.
You haven't asked enough, that's all.
I haven't asked enough? Oh, wow. Okay, well, get ready. He has 20 published books by about Thomas Jefferson and close to 150 essays on Thomas Jefferson. You'll be able to find the location of his books and his essays in the video description. With our show, One Work, 5 Questions, I'll ask Dr. Holowchak 5 questions on one work of Thomas Jefferson's. Our 13th topic is Thomas Jefferson's letter to William Henry Harrison on the 27th of February, 1803. And first, let me give you a brief introduction to the topic. In our last episode, we had something to say about Thomas Jefferson's thoughts on yellow fever. This episode is sort of thematic follow-up on the last episode. At the time that Jefferson wrote this letter to future President William Henry Harrison, Thomas Jefferson then was president and Harrison was the governor of the Indiana Territory. Jefferson's letter begins with some thoughts on urban planning, and he then turns to a thorny issue: Native Americans and the possible expansion of the United States. As governor, Harrison was expected to get the titles of the Indian land. He was also responsible for defending the settlers in the event the Indians retaliated. So let's begin. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, question number 1. Jefferson mentions Harrison's plan to name a town after him. Did he? And if he did, what was the precise name of the city?
Well, it was Jeffersonville, Indiana, and I sent you a grid of it.
Yes.
If you could put that up.
Yes.
He in the letter, let me read significant portions of this letter. He says, in the former, he's speaking to Harrison, Governor Harrison, you mentioned the plan of the town which you had done me the honor to name after me and to lay out according to an idea I had formerly expressed to you. I am thoroughly persuaded that it will be found handsome and pleasant, and I do believe it to be the best means of preserving the cities of America from the scourge of the yellow fever, which being peculiar to our country must be derived from some peculiarity in it. That peculiarity I take to be our cloudless skies. Was he ever wrong there? You know, he, as you can see by the diagram that Jefferson proposes to, you've got, as the city was laid out, he wanted to lay things out like a checkerboard, where you have black and white squares, and say on the black squares, look on the diagram where you see the plots and the squares inside the diamonds, there would be residences and layouts and then streets that way. And then on the squares where you see the cross sections here, this is laid out a little differently, but you'll see 4 triangles in a square in an intersection of 2 roads. There's a square there where there's no development. The idea is to promote circulation of the air and healthful living.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. What was the purpose of having this laid out this way?
He says, he's talking about this, here a constant sun produces too great an accumulation of heat to admit of ventilation. He says, ventilation is indispensably necessary. Thomas, you don't need the adjective or the adverb adjective indispensably necessary before necessary. Anyways, he says, experience has taught us that in the open air of the country, the yellow fever is not only not generated, but ceases to be infectious. And so he, talks about this grid, and this is a grid that he plays with a little later in the letter to Comte de Volney on 8 February 1805. But the idea is both to promote health by having open spaces, by having just as many spaces in a city that are open as are closed off from buildings.
Okay.
All you have to do is go to a place like Baltimore, Maryland, and you see the row houses, or Philadelphia, you see the row houses, and there's buildings everywhere. Everywhere where there's an open space, people want to build something to sort of economize on the land to make it fully useful. Jefferson considers that to be extraordinarily baneful to health. There's a secondary benefit he doesn't mention, and I think he has this abundantly in mind when he's speaking here, and that is he's not a friend to sprawling cities in the first place. He's always been anti-city. He says that in numerous writings, because where you have cities because you have a lot of people thrown together in one space. So you're going to have factories and manufacture so that people live by, by those sorts of things. So you have prostitution as well. You have gambling, you have drinking and things like that. He thinks these are very unhealthy habits because of overcrowding. So if you go back to this grid, everywhere where you have a square where there are, in this example, 6 residences, 6 plots, on each space around it, you have an open square, which allows for ventilation, but also it is not an efficient way to populate a city. What it does effectively, it disperses the population, tremendously over twice the space, So it discourages the growth of cities by spreading out the population. And it also, I would add, limits the possibility for the sprawl of a city, because all cities, Lynchburg's a great example. You have mountains to the north and to the, you have the river to the east and north, and you have natural topographical limits to expansion of the city, rivers, mountains, valleys, whatever. So it's going to limit the sprawl of a city just by its geographical consideration. So it works not only for health, promoting more open spaces, but it also works for discouraging the growth of cities.
Do you think, I know that part of William Henry Harrison's job was to protect the settlers. Do you think a layout like this would have been easy for military to defend?
I know he never says anything about that. I don't even want to speculate. He's not worried in the least about protection from invasions and stuff. I'll say a little bit more about that later on, I think.
Okay.
He says nothing about that. I think that has nothing to do with any of his thoughts.
Okay, question number 2. In the letter, Jefferson mentions this letter is unofficial correspondence and twice mentions it is private. Why did Jefferson write Harrison a private letter?
Well, that can be very easily answered. It's just he's talking about confidential federal affairs, and you don't want, just like we had the recent leak last week of the United States providing Ukrainians intelligence with a lot of information so that they can act on killing Russian generals and so forth. But this is sort of, confidential information that needs to be kept from the public, kept from the general consumption stuff. So that's why he mentions it twice.
Okay. And question number 3, did Jefferson have a genuine concern for the well-being and future of the Indian populations, or was he only concerned with the expansion of the USA?
That's a really tough and good question. I've read it for you. There's a book by Anthony F.C. Wallace here. It's called Jefferson and the Indians, The Tragic Fate of the First Americans. I bought this, in 2010, 12 years ago. I've never gotten beyond the introduction. And I mean that, and I'm not trying to be nasty. It's
Right.
just such a slanted book, anti-Jefferson book, where it, he talks about Jefferson's hatred of Native Americans. Jefferson is only committed to his own self-interest. Jefferson as being a control freak. Jefferson's character can be seen as driven by a desire to fend off some threat to his own freedom in thought and action. It's just, I read it again, and he's just talks about Jefferson committing himself only to his own interests and other people who are thinking the way he thinks. And it's such, Jefferson, as I'll show, he had some questionable views when it came to Native Americans, but we certainly don't get the whole picture from this book. So it's highly recommended that you stay away from that book, even though it's highly praised on the back cover by some people for whatever reason. It's just not a fair assessment. Jefferson's views, let's look at the letter. He says, our system is to live in perpetual peace with the Indians, to cultivate an affectionate attachment from them by everything just and liberal, which we can do for them within the bounds of reason, and by giving them effectual protection against wrongs from our own people. Now, he talks about, as Americans are encroaching upon Native American lands, there's a decrease in game, and it is helpful for them to turn to husbandry, to turn to farming if they want to survive much more efficiently. So he wants to help the Native Americans learn how to farm more effectively, pull them away from hunting, gathering, and things like that, have them settle the lands. And he says in other places, he's certainly open to miscegenation, to Native Americans intermarrying with the American settlers. Okay, so he's got his main is perpetual peace. Now he says later, he says to promote this disposition to exchange lands, he says, which they have to spare and we want. So he says they have something we want, we have something they want. They have lands, we want lands. Okay, and he says for necessaries which we have to spare and they want. So they want some of the fripperies and other things that come with cultured or civilized living, presumably. We shall push our trading uses and be glad to see the good and influential individuals among them run into debt and so forth. So basically he's saying what we're going to do is we're going to ask for their land and trade their land for monies or other things that they want from our culture and so forth. So his twofold plan, he says, is one of love. Mm-hmm. And this is important. If you read this carefully, he says there are these trading houses of American settlers who trade with the Native Americans, and he mentions that the trade generally is imbalanced or unfair. They take the lands from the Native Americans and offer them, a price or goods much inferior to the worth of the lands. Jefferson wants to weed out these independent traders between the Native Americans and the government, and have the government do them. He says, at our trading houses too, we mean to sell so low as merely to repay us costs and charges, so as neither to lessen or enlarge our capital. If we take him seriously, and I do, he's not trying to make tons of money on the basis from Native Americans, right, or get a lot from them. Basically, he wants to have an exchange. He's not trying to unfairly bargain with the Native Americans, but he wants to give them a fair price or fair exchange for what they have to offer. So the idea is that this notion, this push towards occupying the lands toward the east of the Mississippi is sort of inevitable. And of course, we know that Jefferson, if you've read Jefferson, in my book on Thomas Jefferson's political philosophy, Thomas Jefferson in the political philosophy and the metaphysics of utopia, he sees all of North America at some point being, occupied by Americans. And so he's got this push towards getting all that land in the back of his mind. So this is his policy of love, is that we're going to teach them how to farm. We're going to offer them goods or monies in exchange for their lands and at a rightful price, unlike the people that work the trading posts. Then he talks about fear. He says, as to their fear, we're going to work from love and work from fear. As to their fear, we presume that our strength and their weakness is now so visible that they must see we have only to shut our hand to crush them, and that all our liberties to them proceed from motives of pure humanity only. Now, this is a sentence filled with ambivalence. He says, okay, they can see the power of the potential military power of America. So that itself is a motivation from fear to them, a secondary motivation, I think he means. We have only to shut our hand to crush them, which is this notion of crushing is a very powerful metaphor. Why does he choose that? Jefferson has a strongly ambivalent attitude towards the natives. He says, should any tribe be foolhardy enough to take up the hatchet at any time, the seizing the whole country of that tribe and driving them across the Mississippi as the only condition of peace would be an example to others. So in other words, any tribe to the east of the Mississippi, if they should resist our negotiations or whatever, and if they take up the hatchet and want war with us, we'll give them that war. And as a consequence, after we beat them in war, we're going to push them to the other side of the Mississippi. This is really, shows a strong ambivalence by Jefferson, this notion of fear and this notion of fear and love. So.
Okay. Boy, this is a difficult situation to be in. It sounds like to have to make these decisions.
And you don't see Jefferson at his best here necessarily. You see a sort of dark side of Thomas Jefferson. I don't think it's as dark as people make it out to be, but we'll say more.
No, he did what he had to do for the greater good of the country. Question number 4. How did Jefferson plan to assimilate Indians into American culture?
Well, that's the one, as I said, he wanted husbandry. He wanted to introduce them to husbandry. He wanted to buy Native American lands. He wanted miscegenation, interracial mixing between the two cultures and so forth.
Oh, okay.
And, he said he worked from these dual motives, love and fear. The notion of fair exchange was critical for Jefferson. And let's see here. Was he concerned just with expansion in the United States? Yeah, he was Jefferson was neurotically obsessed with expansion of Republican ideals. As he says in his second inaugural address, which comes after this, he said, a government that has elected governors can be as large as it can be and function effectively because we have representative governments, and that's not a large issue for him. Montesquieu and Aristotle millennia before him said, look, the democracy can only work in a small area of space because it means all people have the same capacity to participate in governmental affairs. And because of that, you can't have a large democracy. Well, Jefferson and Madison and other people at the time are thinking this novel notion of elected representatives allows governments to be as large as you want them to be and still be, in effect, democratic, because the representatives can gather together, and as long as they speak on behalf of the interests of the people whom they represent, that works just as well. And he thinks this is a decided improvement over ancient times. So this whole notion here of a fair exchange is
Okay.
tremendously important. And it's important to consider that he did really care about Native Americans. Okay, I mean, that's all I have to say.
He did mention, I noticed that in the letter, he did drive that point home about caring for them and making sure they were okay. So that was nice. But now we have question number 5, which is a little controversial, I think. Historian Patricia Limerick says white men put Indians in a state of dependence. In this letter, Jefferson is talking about running the Indians into debt, so they have to forfeit their land to pay the debt. Based on the information in this letter, is she correct?
Yeah, I'm glad she brings up whiteness again. This is not an issue of whiteness versus white skin versus red skin. It's a matter of American settlers wanting the land driven by Jefferson's vision of a large republic. Jefferson wanted that land, there's no question. Now, was he going to use any excuse or motive to get the land? And in some sense, the answer is yes. I mean, in another letter I have in my book, it's called Dutiful Correspondent, Philosophical Essays on Thomas Jefferson. In the 11th chapter, I talk about Jefferson and Native Americans. It's important to realize he had an ambivalent attitude towards Native Americans. By that, I mean he loved them and he hated them. He loved them because as a young boy, Native tribal leaders would visit his house of his father. And so he was exposed to the Native American tribal leaders very early on, who befriended his father, Peter Jefferson. And Jefferson has great early memories of these. Utases is one for whom he says he remembers as a boy when Utaset gave a talk. He was going to go away from his tribe, and I think he's going to Washington or something, and I mean to the American capital at the time, or the something. Can't be the Washington, obviously, but he's going in some sort of special, going away from his people. And he remembers Utaset giving this speech, and it's a wonderful speech. And he didn't understand a word of it because he didn't understand the native tongue. But everybody was talking, and the sky was dark, and everybody was listening. And Jefferson had tremendous respect for the courage of the Native Americans. He loved them as a boy. That's why I bring up. And so, in some sense, he hated them as a president. And remember, love and hate are manifestations of the same thing. You can't hate what you don't love. So he hated them because a lot of them were resistant to his plan. He wanted to take them into the American nation. He wanted them to miscegenate with the American people. I don't want to talk about race here. This is really not an issue of race so much for Jefferson. Miscegenation was fine with him. And a lot of Native Americans resisted. They didn't want this quote unquote civilized way of life where they're farming and they could be introduced into the American nation. They wanted to live as they live. We understand that today. Jefferson did not understand that. So in some sense, he hated them. And you get him having some strong sentiments here. We have only to shut our hand to crush them. It's like, okay, if they don't listen, we're trying to give you something to improve the quality of your life, and some of them just don't want it. He doesn't get it. We have to understand that. That doesn't make him a wicked person. Right. From the confines of his thoughts concerning civilized living based on Enlightenment ideals, it is a no-lose situation for the Native Americans. Not all of them see that. And we understand that much better from our perspective today. He didn't. So in effect, Jefferson was proposing an eradication. Says eventually, one way or the other, they're going to, the Native American way of life is going to be expunged. It's going to end. Either they're going to miscegenate and become Americans with us and intermarry, and we're all going to become one sort of species, or we're going to be pushing them to the west of the Mississippi, and then at some point he thinks we're going to be occupying those lands and keep pushing the ones that resist till there's nowhere to go, till they're extinct from warring with us. So yeah, his views, and it's important, he does have some bad views here, but I think those views are due to ambivalence. It's due to he has something to offer the natives. Not every one of them, not all the tribes want what he has offered. He's frustrated by that. He doesn't understand it. We're offering you civilization, education. We're offering you all the sciences we have. And some say, I don't care. We don't want it. Again, like I say, we understand that today. Jefferson did not understand it in the least. But his attitude was not hatred. It was ambivalence, love and hate. Hatred because at times because they weren't open to what Jefferson was proposing. So they have Jefferson not at his shiny best.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's nice to see he was human.
And he was very human when he was, in as Secretary of State, feuding with Hamilton, and as president. One of the things I just want to end with is that the exigencies of the office of president made him at times realize that, you have to make some tough decisions. You have to, you're going to ruffle feathers. You can't, not everything you're going to do is going to be a morally perfect decision. You're in a situation where you got the Louisiana Purchase was.
I was just going. Yeah,
I'm going to violate the Constitution. I don't have constitutional warrant for this purchase, but it's stupid not to do it. And even the Federalists, the hard Federalists, agreed that he was right to make the purchase. So it's a tough situation.
Yeah, and I like the fact, I think we should focus more today on the fact that, these were all human. Our founders were not perfect. They made mistakes. They did good. They did bad. But overall, I'm grateful for what they did, for what they gave us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Holowchak, for answering my questions. I've been wondering as I'm reading, it was such a good letter to hear.
It's a tough issue. I have a quote in my book, Beautiful Correspondence. A correspondent, there's a quote, and I don't remember exactly how it goes, but he's talking about the Native Americans. He says, in one sentence, he says something very positive, then he goes off like he does here, says something very negative. And then, this one here, he says, we presume that our strength and their weakness is now so visible. Okay. We have only to shut our hand and crush them. He goes, and that all our liberalities to them proceed from motives of pure humanity. That's perfect ambivalence. We could crush them, but they also see that we're doing this from the right motives.
Right.
He loves them and he hates them. So he's got this ambivalence, and you need to read that instead of just reading him as someone who hates Native Americans. It's not true. You have to go back to his early exposure to Native Americans. He loved them. They just weren't doing what he wanted them to do. Right. And rightfully so. It's their way of life he's trying to take away.
Oh, well, we understand that, especially as a professor and teacher and parent, sometimes it's
understand it today, right?
Yeah.
To understand it from Jefferson, we need to put ourselves in his shoes, which is what historians don't do. Not just put ourselves in his time, put ourselves in his particular circumstances, having been exposed to Native American culture, seeing the bravery, the courage of their leaders, having great thoughts about the Native American culture. His note in Notes on Virginia is nothing bad to say about them at all.
Mhm.
and then, being hurt by them. In effect, he's being hurt by them while he's president. They're not listening to me, even though I'm openly giving them the olive branch. So
Mhm. Wow. Oh, if we could only transport ourselves back to those days, that would be wonderful.
that's what good history is all about.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's that simple.
Yeah.
Instead of sitting back, it's easy, just like Wallace does. From reading selectively from his letters, you can say Jefferson was a real son of a bitch when it came to Indians. He just hated them. Well, you have to have a selective approach to history to get that, and then you also have to suffer the crime of presentism, which is just to use the present as a way of judging the past. In which case, every person looks the fool if you do that.
Right.
Every person comes out to be a fool if you use present perspective. So,
Yeah. Oh, that's my pet peeve. Can you hold your book up again so everyone can just get a good look at the cover? So when they
gonna be back.
okay, dutiful course.
Littlefields, called Dutiful Correspondent, Philosophical Essays. It is the first book I've ever published out of my 20 books on Thomas Jefferson. And
Oh, wow.
it came out of just writing a bunch of philosophical essays on Jefferson. And my approach to Jefferson is more philosophical than historical, as you know. And I thought, instead of just publishing independently all these essays in journals, why not put a book together focusing on his philosophical thinking? And I did that, and that
Wow.
led to so many other books, easy enough to write on this guy.
Well, it sounds like this would be a good addition to the reading list for my current class on the American West. Yeah.
And in my book on Jefferson's political philosophy, because I talk quite a bit about Jefferson's love of land. And let me say something else at the expense of being a little verbose here. But when Jefferson looked at land more than any other figure of his day, he didn't just see dirt, trees. He saw the trees cleared, he saw the land farmed, or he saw the land built up.
Okay.
And a small town being built or something. He saw land for the people of that time meant money. It was the equivalent of money. You didn't have money in circulation, so you had land. The more land you had, the more property you had. Slaves were property too. The more important, the wealthier you were. But Jefferson, I made this point in this book and other books, he looked at land unlike when I met Jerry Falwell Jr., poor man who came to disgrace at the Liberty. Jerry had exactly the same view of land. He looked at certain land and saw development. I can make a ski resort here or this or that, whatever the point. I'm not making a moral proclamation here, but some people look at land and see the land. Some people look at land and see an infinite number of possibilities for what we can do with that land. Jefferson was that kind of person.
Wow. That's nice to have that vision and to be able to see the completed product before it's even started.
Few people have that. He had that.
Well, we are very fortunate to have had him as our founding father, I believe. Okay, so next week we turn to a very personal issue, Jefferson's thought on religion, and another letter to Dr. Benjamin Rush. Is this the letter that's my favorite letter?
Your favorite, yeah.
Oh.
Your favorite letter.
Oh, I can't wait.
And
okay.
Yeah, I can give you a teaser on that. We will learn much about Thomas Jefferson's views on morality and religion. We can learn just about everything if we read this carefully. The question to ask is his views on Jesus here. Was Jesus the Son of God? Was he, like others thought, Joseph Priestley, a man who was given divine powers while he was a man by God to perform miracles in things like that, and to raise up from the dead and all that stuff? Or was he just a mere mortal who had a lot of very important, morality enhancing things to say. So we'll answer that question. What was
Okay.
his views of Jesus?
Oh, I can't wait. I can't wait to learn more.
In the same year, early in 1803, this same, not long after this letter that we just did. So,
Boy, if he only had Microsoft Word back then. He wrote a lot.
I hate to think about his insane productivity if he had Word.
Wow.
Over 18,000 letters and everything else that he wrote. He was insanely productive.
18,000 letters?
19,000 plus. And he had a polygraph machine, which was a machine that allowed you, while you're writing one letter, it was attached to an arm that would duplicate the letter. So he had duplicates of his letters made, which made the writing process slower. Go online, look up Jefferson polygraph. There's one at Poplar Forest on display. If he had the computer technology we have, imagine his letter writing would be insane.
Wow.
You might be talking about 40,000 letters or something, which is hard to imagine.
Wow. Oh, that's wonderful. I'm glad we have everything preserved. So
They would have been sent email.
Yeah.
He probably would have kept them all too, though.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'm done for the day.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Holowchak, for answering my questions again. If you'd like to contact Dr. Holowchak, you can reach him at mholowchak@hotmail.com or his Facebook page, Thomas Jefferson. Bring him home to Monticello, Citizens for Change. Dr. Holowchak is available for conferences, and he can also sign books. And if you'd like to order any of his books, you can contact him via his email and he'll be happy to help you. Oh, well, thank you so much, Dr. Holowchak.
Thank you. You have a great day.
You too. Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.